So I was quite amused earlier about the dead academic scribblers, because I was thinking about who the economists who influenced me in thinking about some of our labour market issues, and Ricardo is one of them. So, Ricardo, this might be a death sentence. Let me just say that I'm not. I don't work for Harambee. I wasn't involved in setting it up. I don't earn a living from Harambee. I have a strong personal connection with the people who did, and I was involved in the initial conceptualization and thinking it through. I'm policy wonk for as far as those things go in South Africa, and I kind of circulate into and out of government on a regular basis. And I was interested in this project because I'm interested in the labour market and what our many problems are in the labour market. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the problem that the Harambee project seeks to solve, which is pretty extreme. Where'd I point there? So first, quickly, the Harambee project it's a public-private partnership. That's important. It's got money from government, which raises policy questions about when and why governments would want to put money into this kind of project. That aims to place young people who are from the most excluded portions of the labour market into entry-level jobs in the formal sector. This is one of the things that I think is important about Ricardo's work is you really want to get people into more productive activities. And most of the developing world, a lot of people sit in very unproductive activities in the agricultural sector or in the informal sector. The formal sector is where the action is, and Harambee is very clear that this is where you want to get people into if you want to build inclusion over time. As I said, it's focused on people who are most excluded from the labour market. I'll talk a little bit about that in more detail now. But the thing to think about is that exclusion is not evenly distributed across the population of people who don't have jobs. There are some people who face much higher barriers to inclusion than others. And if you're going to choose to do projects that promote inclusion, one of the questions you've got to ask is, are you looking for the people who are most likely to have become included on their own terms through their own action, or do you want to look for people who are further down the queue? So what kind of people benefit from Harambee's work? Well, there's some data from internal surveys of the candidates, and there have been 500,000 people who've applied to become candidates for Harambee. Not all have gotten through. I'll talk about that in a bit. But they come from fairly large households. They come from households in which in the third of the households, nobody has graduated from high school. They come from very poor households. 70% come from households in which someone receives a social grant. In South Africa, social grants are means tested, and means if you're in one of those households, you're pretty poor. In the households in which there are people who work, and a lot of households there's nobody who works, 80% of those people are in very precarious, low-wage activities, often in the informal sector or security guards, that kind of very low-wage, low-skill service sector work. It's demand-led, so Harambee works very closely with employers to look for exactly the kind of people that they work with. It's large scale, and this is an issue about the returns to this kind of activity. You really do get returns from being big, from having lots of employers and therefore lots of options to put people into, and being big enough to attract large numbers of people in the first place, so that you can learn about what the labour market is like, who's out there. In the first 4 years, and I think this is really actually rather incredible, 16,000 young people who come from pretty excluded communities have been placed in formal sector jobs by Harambee. So, South Africa's labour market. The first thing to know, everybody knows this, very high levels of unemployment. This is the inverse, this is the employment ratio. Barely 40% of South African adults have a job of any description, including informal sector. The norms for the developing world are over 60%, some are higher, but that includes agricultural work. South Africa has no agricultural sector to speak of, and from an employment point of view, it has employment levels in agriculture that are similar to Europe's. It's a very low employment economy, but it's a very tight labour market for skilled people. So the unemployment rate for people without a matric, without a school leaving certificate, is well north of 40%. The unemployment rate for people with a university degree is in single digits. I'm going to talk about what that means in a minute, but the other thing to understand is how bad our schools are. Our schools deliver terrible learning outcomes that are a disaster for the learners themselves, but equally a disaster for employers. These are the PISA tests in maths. South Africa comes in, compared to middle-income countries, comes in second last, despite spending a lot more than most middle-income countries. The results are also very unevenly distributed. So on the right are by quintile of households, because that's how our schools are financed. And the PISA scores for low-income households are incredibly low. This is another version of that same problem, the very uneven quality of our education. What that is tracking of literacy scores across 3 years for grades 3, 4, and 5. The solid lines are for schools that under apartheid were designated for black kids. The broken lines are for schools that under apartheid were designated for white kids. The black schools remain black. The white schools are much more integrated. By grade 5, the typical kid in a formerly white school has 2-year reading advantage over, by grade 3, a kid in a formerly white school has a 2-year reading advantage over a kid from a black school. It's just, the schools are a disaster, and what it creates is this vast labor market mismatch. On the one hand, you've got this big demand for high-skill labor, unmet demand, lots of constraints on it, because our economy is on this kind of high-skill growth path, and you've got an education system that can't produce the people that the economy needs. So what do employers do? Well, they do a bunch of things. One of them is I'll just go to the next slide quickly. Sorry, I'm losing list of my slides. The mismatch is accentuated by policymakers, by policymaking, which has discouraged low productivity activities in a big way. One of the ways it does that is by having very high minimum wages, which are a very large proportion of the average wage in all sectors, which means that employers have a preference for experienced workers, because if young and inexperienced workers can't sell themselves at a discount to experienced workers, well then the employers are going to go for experienced workers. The other thing it does is it makes the dismissal of unsuitable recruits very difficult and very costly and very administratively tiresome. And so once again, employers are looking for signals of suitability for the workplace, so they will go for experienced workers who've got skills, which means young people face unemployment rates that are twice as high as the national average, which is already pretty high. Because our education system is so bad, employers have very little faith in the quality of staff they might recruit from. But not only is the education system bad, it also offers very, very poor signaling of suitability. So it's very hard for employers to figure out who's going to be good at any particular job that they might offer them. So employers are unable to use education results to figure out if somebody is good at maths, can speak English, is going to be punctual. In the paper, I talk about one of the kids I interviewed who was going on a Harambee course, who talked about how through her high school career, she was routinely not at school at least 1 day a week. I asked her, did nobody say anything about that? She said no, it was okay. So an employer can't even rely on the fact that somebody's got a school leaving certificate to know that this person has the behavioral norm of coming to school every day. So employers find these qualifications very unsuitable for understanding who's going to be a good fit and who's not going to be a good fit. So what do they do? Well, one of the things they do is what I've already said, is they move towards high skill activities. Over the last decade and a half or so, 75% of the net new jobs created in South Africa were medium and high skill jobs in an economy in which unskilled workers are the norm. Another thing that employers do is they they develop recruitment strategies that make sure that limit people's ability to get into work. So they employ people who are not South African, they employ people who have workplace experience, and they use quick and nasty methods for assessing suitability. what you have is levels of inclusion and exclusion. You've got a high skill core who's very included, and and progressively more and more exclusion based on whether people have connections to the labor market. One of the things employers do is they recruit from the networks of their existing employees. Over 60% of people interviewed in a recent survey in South Africa asked, where did they get their job? They got their job from a friend or family member, or heard about the job from a friend or family member, which means that the network you are in is a vehicle for inclusion or exclusion if you're not in it. Harambee works with employers to try and expand the recruitment pool. So firstly, it sits with employers to try and understand what kind of jobs they got, what do people need, what skills do people need to get into those jobs and stay in those jobs for a year, on the basis that if you get into a job and stay in that job for a year, you're likely to be employed for the rest of your life or have a very decent chance of doing that. It selects based on quite low criteria. You've got to have a matric, a school leaving certificate, you're not working, you're looking for work, you have less than 1 year's work experience, you come from a poor household. They've had 500,000 people apply. Not all of those are in the right place. Not all of those meet all those criteria. 140,000 kids came in to do assessment tests, which is the next stage. The assessment tests work out what kinds of industries these people are most likely to be suitable for, and then is able to stream them into a series of progressively finer meshes to figure out who fits best where, and then working with employers is then able to place those people after having gone through the appropriate training. So they've got 7 different training programs at the moment, some for BPOs, some for retail, some for the leisure industry, with different criteria and different costs, different syllabus and curriculum. But these are quite intensive programs, and the 16,000 kids who've gone through them have basically all been placed. There's another group of kids who've self-placed, is the language that Harambee uses, which is not a very nice language, I don't think, but that's what they do. Retention is doing well, although the data here are harder to assess because there's quite a lot of variability, but it does appear that it's ahead of industry norms. So the kids who are coming out of this program from the BPO sector, it's what it seems like is they're not as productive as people recruit from in traditional ways initially, but they catch up quickly and then start to exceed. I'm going to be very, very quick to sum up, and I'm going to just ask this question of, which I think is the policy question, which is how I got into this in the first place, is Harambee just moving people from the back of the employment queue to somewhere close to the front? And if that is all it's doing, is that worth doing? Are the resources consumed in doing that adding any value to the society other than the fact that some people are benefiting, but at the expense potentially of others who might have got those jobs at all? I think the answer, and I can't prove this with data, but I think the answer must be yes. I think that expanding the networks of who is in the labor market is good for society as a whole. It democratizes the labor market in a way that isn't done in the absence of this kind of intervention. I think that the benefits of that are intergenerational and will be felt over a long period rather than being felt immediately. I think that it clearly is doing something for productivity and something for improving the skill set of the workforce as a whole. But I think the biggest contribution is that it is reducing this dynamic of exclusion that traps some people particularly far away from the labor market and from access to formal sector jobs. Thank you.
Well, I hope I know something about work and jobs. In addition to that, I'm also a research fellow at a think tank in London, and I'm a visiting professor at the University of Leicester in the East Midlands of England. Well, given that we're at Harvard, I thought I'd start by quoting a member of the Harvard faculty that the purpose of all of this is to try and equip people with the capabilities they need to choose lives that they have reason to value. Now, you'll all recognise that as Amartya Sen, I think, and it's a very important principle to bear in mind as we think about these two projects, which are effectively about giving people autonomy, control, and self-respect. Work has an intrinsic value, self-evidently, but it's also useful for something. It's about enabling us to realise who we are as human beings. I'm going to make a few very brief comments on Antony's paper and then come back for a second bite of the cherry after Laszlo's spoken. So just a couple of reflections on Antony's paper. First of all, much of what he had to say, I think, reflects the content of the report that Jennifer presented last night, and in particular that spatial factors matter. Actually getting people from one part of the city to where the jobs are can be a huge problem. That is obviously about infrastructure, public transport, housing policy, urban development and planning. And it's difficult to see how Harambee is able to solve that problem. The second point, which I think is really important, is that this was inspired initially by Yellowwoods, who are a significant, I think, are they a private equity business in South Africa? The people who started it up.
Mostly financial services and then
and they're trying to fill a gap that in other countries would probably have been filled by the state. One of the points that I want to reflect on when I come back for my second bite of the cherry is to what extent can these programs, both Harambee and Integrom, be scaled up significantly without the involvement of the state as an actor? And I think that comes back to a point that Richard Samans was making this morning about the public administrative capacity. Is the state able and competent to engage with these problems in the right way? And if not, how do you build that competence and capability? I'm going to stop there for a moment, give Laszlo the floor and come back again and hope you'll be patient with me. Thank you very much.